Okay, let's dive into the sources you've pulled together for this deep dive. The topic: Leonardo da Vinci.
Hmm.
I mean, not just the genius everyone knows, but that enduring mystery around him. The ultimate Renaissance man, right?
Yeah.
Artist, inventor, scientist.
Absolutely. He fascinated people back then, and honestly, he still does.
He really does. And when you look through the materials, there's this common thread, isn't there?
Yeah.
Huge admiration, obviously, but also this feeling that he was, well, hard to fully grasp.
Yeah, unfathomable is a word that comes up.
Yeah.
An all-sided genius, but sort of complex and guarded.
Right. Now, one specific source you included really shifts the perspective. Sigmund Freud's study on Leonardo, a psychosexual study of an infantile reminiscence.
Ah, yes.
And that's going to be our main focus today, looking at how Freud used his particular lens to try and understand Leonardo's inner world.
It's a really interesting approach. Freud's goal, as outlined in the excerpts you've got there, isn't really to knock Leonardo down a peg or anything.
Right.
No, it's more about using his psychoanalytic framework, thinking about universal human stuff, psychological mechanisms to make sense of him.
So he's looking at these little details Leonardo left behind.
Exactly, things that might seem insignificant. And he treats them as clues,
Yeah.
clues to the hidden psychic forces that might have shaped this incredible, but yeah, often puzzling person.
So using Freud's specific analysis, outlined in that one key source, to build a picture of this historical figure who appears in all the other sources, the mission is basically to understand Freud's argument based on the material you gathered.
Precisely. We're going to follow his line of reasoning, see how he connects the dots he finds.
Okay. But first, let's ground ourselves a bit. What do the other sources say about Leonardo himself? Beyond the genius label, what puzzles or contradictions pop up in those biographical accounts?
Well, one thing that comes across clearly, even from contemporary accounts mentioned in your sources, is this internal conflict, especially between the artist and the scientist in him. His scientific work was groundbreaking, apparently, but mostly unpublished. The art is famous, of course, but the investigator was always there, sometimes, maybe, getting in the way of the art, or even suppressing it.
Getting in the way? How so?
Well, there's that story, maybe from Vasari's account in your materials, about Leonardo on his deathbed sort of reproaching himself for not having, perfected his art.
Wow. A man like that feeling he hadn't done enough artistically.
Yeah.
That connects to his work habits, doesn't it? Which other sources definitely describe as, well, puzzling.
Oh, yeah. Notoriously slow, leaving major works unfinished.
Like The Last Supper. Took years, right? With long gaps.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the Mona Lisa worked on it forever, apparently never even delivered it. The Battle of Anghiari just, poof, gone because of some technical experiment.
So how did people back then react to this based on the sources?
A lot of them were baffled, called him unsteady, flighty,
But the Freud text offers a different take.
It does. It argues that, look, the sheer amount of preparatory work he did, the incredible detail, the richness of ideas, maybe it wasn't flightiness, maybe it was hesitation, really high standards, even a kind of inhibition when it came to actually finishing.
Inhibition.
Yeah, the Freud text even brings up a quote from a pupil, something like, he seemed to tremble whenever he began to paint.
Trembling. That really changes the picture. From just being distractible to maybe some intense internal thing going on.
Right. It suggests that experimental drive, which fueled his science, might have sometimes worked against the art, like with that Battle of Anghiari fresco.
These sides of him were just so intertwined, maybe even at odds sometimes.
And those contradictions weren't just in his work, they were in his character too, according to your sources.
Yeah, some accounts paint him as incredibly gentle, hated conflict, didn't eat meat because it felt wrong to harm animals.
Bought caged birds just to set them free.
Yeah.
Called war horrific. Man, the worst of the wild beasts.
Yeah.
A real sort of sensitivity. But then, the Freud text points out this striking contrast. The same gentle person apparently went to executions to sketch the faces of the condemned.
Wow.
Invented really cruel weapons and, as the biographical details show, he worked for Cesar Borgia, not exactly a nice guy, as his chief military engineer.
And his notes don't show any criticism or sympathy.
Apparently not, just sort of factual detachment. Which leads to that point made in one of the analyses you've got. He almost seems indifferent to our usual ideas of good and evil.
That contrast is really jarring. Condemning war, but enabling a warlord.
It really makes you question how to approach him. And it's exactly these kinds of puzzles, these contradictions documented across the sources that the Freud text wants to dig into.
Okay, so this is where Freud's specific method comes in, the one laid out in the text you provided.
Right. psychoanalysis, looking at the small stuff, slips of the tongue, forgetting things.
Or childhood memories.
Or childhood memories, exactly. Seeing them not just as random, but as like little windows into hidden feelings, unconscious stuff. And a key idea Freud puts forward is that these memories aren't always literal snapshots of the past.
Not literal.
Sometimes they can be later fantasies, ideas or feelings from the present that get sort of projected back onto childhood.
Like rewriting your own history a bit?
Sort of, yeah. Like Freud says, maybe like ancient historians reflecting their own time when writing about the past. But the crucial point for him is because it's a fantasy, created unconsciously, it's incredibly meaningful. The way it's constructed tells you something important.
And Leonardo, whose personal life is pretty mysterious in the other sources, actually left behind one of these childhood memories.
Apparently just one recorded one. And Freud found it, as the text notes, tucked away in Leonardo's scientific notebooks, right in the middle of notes about bird flight.
That's quite a place for it. What did it say?
He pauses his scientific thoughts to write this, and the text quotes it directly. It seems that it had been destined before that I should occupy myself so thoroughly with the vulture.
Okay.
For it comes to my mind as a very early memory. When I was still in the cradle, a vulture came down to me. He opened my mouth with his tail and struck me a few times with his tail against my lips.
Whoa. Okay. That is specific and odd. A vulture in his cradle using its tail on his mouth.
Yeah, definitely bizarre. And Freud dives right in, treating it not as fact, but as a really significant fantasy.
So how does he start to decode that?
Well, first he looks at the imagery. The coda, the tail. Following symbolic language he saw elsewhere, he interprets that as representing a male genital, a penis.
Okay. We're definitely in Freudian territory now.
We are. And then the action taking the tail, into the mouth. He links that sensation back to the earliest comfort, the earliest pleasure, suckling at the mother's breast.
Back to infancy, when I was still in the cradle, like the memory says.
Exactly. Connecting the seemingly strange image back to that fundamental mother-infant bond.
Okay, so tail equals phallus, mouth action equals nursing, but the main character is the vulture. What's the significance of the vulture for Freud?
This is where Freud brings in some outside knowledge, stuff he figured Leonardo might have known, as the text mentions. He talks about the ancient Egyptian belief, written about by Horapollo,
Which was?
that vultures were all female. They believed vultures could reproduce without males, impregnated just by the wind.
Wow. All female.
Yeah. And this fable was apparently even used by some early church fathers as a kind of analogy to support the idea of the virgin birth.
Virgin birth, a mother but no earthly father.
Exactly. And Leonardo was illegitimate. He had his mother, Caterina, but no father present in his very earliest years. So Freud suggests this fable could have resonated deeply, unconsciously. The fantasy in this reading is Leonardo essentially saying, I too am a vulture child, a child with a mother but no father.
Linking his own situation directly to this ancient symbol of mother-only creation. That's quite an interpretation from one sentence.
It is. It bundles together the echo of pleasure at his mother's breast with this profound idea about his origins. And Freud suggests maybe his identification with the Christ child, another figure with a virgin mother. No earthly father could have made this fantasy feel even more important to him later.
Okay, that's a complex web Freud weaves there. How does he then connect this very specific fantasy interpretation to Leonardo's general character? Like his intense curiosity, that investigative drive we see in the other sources.
Well, Freud argues that those first few years, spent basically alone with his mother, were absolutely crucial. That specific setup mother, no father figure readily apparent, poses a fundamental question for a child. Where do babies come from? What's a father for?
The big questions.
The big questions, right there in his own life from day one. So Freud's theory is that this personal mystery turned him into an investigator right from the start. His scientific curiosity about everything from bird flight, where the fantasy itself pops up, to anatomy, is fundamentally linked back to that initial infantile sexual investigation.
Yeah.
Trying to figure out the puzzle of origins.
So his scientific drive wasn't just intellectual curiosity. It was rooted in this very personal childhood riddle.
That's the argument Freud makes. It recasts that broad genius in a very specific psychological light.
It's quite a thought. How much of what drives us as adults, our passions, our questions, might stem from those really early puzzles?
Exactly. Which brings us neatly to sublimation, a key concept in the Freud text you've got.
Right. Sublimation. Talk us through that.
So in basic Freudian terms, it's about channeling your fundamental drives, your sexual energy,
Yeah.
away from direct sexual goals.
Towards what?
towards other things, non-sexual things society often values like work, art, intellectual pursuits. It's like redirecting that powerful energy.
So instead of sex, you get science or painting.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And Freud sees Leonardo as like a prime example of this. After that initial burst of childhood curiosity, fueled by his family situation, Freud argues Leonardo managed to sublimate a huge chunk of his libido into that relentless drive to investigate and create.
And this sublimation happened alongside what seemed like a pretty restricted actual sex life, based on the biographical accounts.
That's how Freud connects it, yes.
Yeah.
The energy went into the work, not into conventional relationships, seemingly, which leads us to his actual relationships, especially with his pupils.
Ah, yes, the handsome young men he took on as apprentices. The sources mention them.
They do. And Freud really zeroes in on this. He knows Leonardo chose notably good-looking boys and youths, cared for them deeply almost, Freud says, like a mother, maybe echoing his own mother's care for him. Now, standard biographies might just call these apprenticeships, maybe close mentorships. But Freud digs deeper. He thinks that even if there wasn't overt sexual activity, and he acknowledges modern biographers tend to reject that idea, there were likely very strong, affectionate, emotionally charged bonds.
And he bases this on?
Well, partly on the observation, noted in the text, that none of these beautiful pupils actually became great artists themselves, which suggests maybe beauty was the main draw, not raw talent. That's an interpretation Freud offers that you might not find highlighted elsewhere.
Interesting point. How else does Freud support this more psychological reading?
He points to Leonardo's notebooks, that famous mirror writing. In amongst all the incredible science and art, you find these really strange entries.
Strange how?
Almost pedantic little notes about his pupils' clothes, what they cost, minor expenses for shoes, cloaks, things like that.
Freud thinks that's significant. Laundry lists.
He does. He compares them to other detached entries Freud mentions elsewhere, like Leonardo's notes on his own mother's funeral costs. Freud sees these as examples of repressed feelings bubbling up in distorted ways.
Oh, so.
The idea is that powerful emotions may be connected to his mother, may be connected to these young men, couldn't be expressed directly. So the energy, the psychic charge, gets displaced onto these trivial, meticulously recorded details. Or in repetitions, like noting his father's death time as at 7 o'clock twice. It's the unconscious forcing its way out, but sneakily attached to something mundane.
Like the emotion is there, but it can only show itself in this odd, overly precise way.
That's the psychoanalytic reading. So Freud takes the implication of homosexuality he sees in the vulture fantasy, combines it with his analysis of Leonardo's behavior towards these pupils in these peculiar diary entries.
And he concludes.
He interprets the whole picture as Leonardo unconsciously saying, through the fantasy and his life patterns, because of the erotic connection to my mother, I became homosexual.
Wow. That is a very direct and I imagine pretty controversial statement, especially compared to how other sources handle his personal life, tracing it right back to the mother relationship.
It is. And Freud doesn't stop there. He connects this psychosexual interpretation back to Leonardo's art, specifically to the most famous element of all.
The smile. The Mona Lisa smile.
Exactly. That mysterious expression. Art critics and historians in your sources have spilled oceans of ink on it, right?
For centuries.
Freud's take is that artists often unconsciously put their deepest secrets, their hidden feelings, into their work. And that smile not just on Mona Lisa, but echoed in later figures like John the Baptist, Leda, Bacchus, might have tapped into or represented a very old, deep memory or feeling related to his mother.
His mother's smile.
That's the suggestion. Freud notes Leonardo did early drawings of laughing feminine heads and children's heads, maybe his mother and himself. He then points to Walter Pater's famous description of the Mona Lisa smile, having that double sense, incredible tenderness, but also something sinister or threatening.
Tenderness and threat. How does Freud explain that duality?
He links it back to the mother's love again. He speculates, based on her situation perhaps, that her love might have been incredibly intense, maybe overwhelming, impetuous is the word he uses. And this intense early love, while nurturing, might have, in a way, hindered his later masculine development by sort of overstimulating his erotic feelings too early.
So the tenderness is the memory of that maternal bond.
And the hint of threat is the potential negative consequence for his later psychosexual life, according to this specific analysis. It's a purely psychological reading of that famous feature.
Very different from just talking about sfumato technique or who the sitter was. What about those later figures, the androgynous ones, John the Baptist, Bacchus?
Right. They're often described, even in non-Freudian analyses in your sources, as looking like pretty boys with feminine features, feminine softness. and they often have that same smile. Freud interprets these figures as maybe representing a kind of blissful union of the male and female nature. His idea is that Leonardo might have been artistically trying to resolve or express the complexities of his own development, his own love life, through them. Like a wish fulfillment, merging the tender mother figure with a youthful male form.
Using art to process these deep internal dynamics. The mother is obviously central here, but the father figure, Ser Piero, also comes into play in Freud's analysis, especially after Leonardo moved into his household.
Definitely. That brought in a more standard family structure. And in Freud's view, this led to the usual dynamics, identifying with the father some level of rivalry.
And Freud sees echoes of this father-son thing in Leonardo's adult life, too.
He does. He suggests Leonardo's known taste for luxury, nice clothes, servants, horses, might have been a kind of compulsion to imitate, maybe even outdo his father, to play the great gentleman, perhaps contrasting with his mother's humbler origins.
Like a psychological competition playing out in his lifestyle choices.
Possibly. And even his way of working, creating these amazing things, but then seeming detached, not worrying about their fate. Freud connects that back to the father, too. Mirroring, perhaps, how Ser Piero wasn't directly involved in Leonardo's earliest years.
An echo of that early relationship in his creative process itself.
Yeah, and even the detached way Leonardo noted his father's death, or the fall of his patron Ludovico Sforza, who was like a major father figure in his adult life, according to the biographical sources. Freud sees that lack of expressed emotion as maybe covering up repressed feelings towards the original father. The feeling gets suppressed into just a cold, factual note.
It's like these patterns set up really early just keep repeating or resonating throughout his life.
It really underscores Freud's core idea presented in that text about how foundational those early relationships are, shaping us in ways we might not even realize.
Moving beyond the purely personal, the Freud text also touches on Leonardo's views on religion and some of his more playful behaviors. Things noted in other sources, too.
Right. Religion first. Some historical accounts you have mentioned he was actually accused of being irreligious. And it kind of fits, doesn't it? As an investigator, he wasn't going to be bound by scripture if his observations contradicted it.
Like disputing the flood based on fossils.
Exactly. Using geological timescales that were way ahead of his era, his art often humanized religious figures, brought them down to earth. And his later writings, based on your sources, show respect for a creator of nature, but not much sign of a personal relationship with God in the conventional sense. Freud suggests he basically conquered religion, dogma, through his scientific mindset.
It fits the profile of the ultimate observer. And his obsession with flight, that seems central, appearing in the vulture memory in his notebooks.
Freud connects that too. He links the common dream of flying back to, well, infantile wishes about sexual potency or accomplishment.
How does he make that connection?
He points to things like slang to bird, meaning sex in German, or the Italian word for bird, lucello, also being slang for penis. His argument is that a child's intense curiosity about adult sexuality sometimes gets disguised, unconsciously, in these dreams or fantasies of flying, representing a desire for that grown-up power or freedom.
So Leonardo's massive scientific effort to achieve flight might have roots in that very early, maybe repressed curiosity.
That's the interpretation offered in the Freud text, yeah. The analysis also mentions Leonardo's infantile side, his playfulness, which biographical accounts also pick up on.
Yeah, making mechanical lions and stuff for parties.
Exactly. Or that lizard with wings made of mercury, or blowing up sheep intestines with bellows as a kind of party trick or demonstration.
Adds a layer of unexpected whimsy to the serious genius image.
It does. And Freud notes that sometimes biographers maybe took this playful side too literally, like those fantastic letters he wrote about travels in Syria. Freud sees them as imaginative play, wish fulfillment maybe, not actual travel logs. Even his designs for the Accademia Vinciana, Freud suggests, might have been more of an idealized, playful concept than a real functioning institution.
Suggests part of him never lost that childlike imagination.
And Freud is careful here. In the text you provided, he explicitly says he doesn't think Leonardo was clinically neurotic or somehow defective.
Right.
He sees these intense traits, the obsessive investigation as a kind of reasoning mania, the inability to finish things as aboulias, as extreme versions of universal processes, substitutive formations, he calls them, things that happen to everyone as we grow up, adapt to society, and inevitably repress some impulses.
So Leonardo wasn't sick, he just experienced these common psychological adjustments very intensely.
That's the idea. His specific path involved repressing that powerful mother love, which then fueled the sublimation into science and art and shaped those complex, idealized feelings for his pupils. He's presented as an extraordinary example of universal psychological forces, placing him near what Freud called the compulsive type.
It's a detailed psychological portrait trying to make sense of the whole person. But Freud himself admits it's speculative to some extent, right? He calls it partly a psychoanalytic romance.
He does, because the historical record is so thin on Leonardo's inner life. You can't put Leonardo on the couch, obviously. Freud acknowledges the lack of material is the limitation, not the method itself, but it's an important caveat right there in the text you shared. Still, even with that caveat, it's a fascinating attempt to understand him.
So summing up Freud's argument from the text you included, he takes all these disparate threads, the weird childhood memory, the work habits, the character paradoxes mentioned in biographies, those odd diary entries, the relationships with pupils,
And weaves them into a specific psychoanalytic narrative. He argues that Leonardo's early life, his unique family situation, the resulting repression and sublimation, these were the deep currents shaping everything. Not just his personality, but his genius, his struggles, even the specific themes in that iconic smile in his art.
It's trying to understand this towering figure through what Freud saw as universal psychological laws, drawing heavily on that one key text while framing it with the broader biographical details from your other sources.
It definitely highlights how central Freud believed those earliest experiences are, the hidden drivers behind behavior and creativity, even for someone as exceptional as Leonardo.
Makes you think about how those deep, maybe unconscious forces work in all of us.
For sure, even if we're not Leonardo da Vinci.
So, considering all this material, especially Freud's unique perspective within it, if our earliest experiences, our deepest desires, maybe even things we've pushed down, are somehow tangled up in who we are and what we create, well, it makes you wonder, doesn't it? What unconscious forces might be shaping your own drives, your passions, maybe even the things you feel compelled to do or make in your life?